Well, Latin 2. If we're going to launch into subjunctives, then let's just launch into subjunctives. Let's do it. It's time. There's no point in learning the forms of subjunctive verbs if we're not going to learn the context for using subjunctive verbs. Speaking of that, you do need to know the forms of the subjunctive verbs. I just, the day before this, uploaded a video on imperfect and pluperfect subjunctives. So if you have not already looked at it, go watch that video, Subjunctives, Imperfect and Pluperfect, because I am going to be using sentences with those in them, and I'm not going to stop and explain the form. So go watch that one. And then this one will just make that much more sense, all right? But in the meantime, I'm going to talk about cum clauses. It is the first of our major subjunctive subordinate clauses to get introduced. Not technically the first subordinate clause, since relatives are a type of that. But it is the first big subordinate clause that uses subjunctives, all right? And already you might notice something that is different between this and a lot of the other names of clauses, right? Cum clause, it's called a cum clause because it starts with the word cum, which isn't the way these things are usually named, right? Usually they have some like weird, complicated grammatical name like substantiatory and cohational clause, or some nonsense that when you break it apart makes sense, but at the outset sounds really scary. The reason why for cum clauses we just say cum clauses is because they do have big, scary technical names, but there's not one of them, there's a few. And cum clauses refer to all the clauses that start with cum, when really there's more than one kind, all right? But they all start with cum. So here are the two kinds of cum clauses. Actually, there are more than two kinds of cum clauses, but in Latin 2, there's only two you need to worry about. So if you want to learn the rest of them anyway, or if you're not in Latin 2 and you actually need to know them all, then you can go back to a video that I actually uploaded several months before this one that is titled Cum Clauses, parentheses all, as opposed to this one, which is Cum Clauses, parentheses some. Because this is only dealing with some of them, specifically the cum circumstantial clause and the cum causal clause. Those are the two that we're going to deal with here. And they're set up the same way. To form one, all you need is a cum and a subjunctive. I mean, technically you need a main clause as well, but there's nothing unique or special about the main clause. You just have a regular old main clause and then a subordinate clause that starts with cum and has a subjunctive verb in it. That's all you need for a cum clause to exist, at least if it's a cum circumstantial or a cum causal clause. Now, the distinction between these can be hard to tell because grammatically there's no distinction between them, but sometimes when you're translating them, it sounds better to say when. Sometimes when you're translating them, it sounds better to say since or because. Well, if it makes more sense to say when, then chances are this is best described as showing a circumstance under which something happens, in that which case we call it circumstantial. And if it sounds better with a since or a because, then we would say it's causal in nature. It's showing the reason why something happens, right? So, but in all honesty, most of the cums that you're ever going to see translate as when, the vast majority of them. I know that cum can be a problematic word because the first time we learned it, it was the preposition with. But even in Latin 1, we saw cum meaning when, although not with a subjunctive. And there is a reason why it uses the subjunctive sometimes and not others. If you want to know more about that, well, go back to this video and it will tell you the reason why. But for now, let's just worry about this, right? Cums with a subjunctive, when it means when it means since or because. And, in the video that I put up before this, Subjunctives Part 0, which if you haven't seen that yet, maybe go back and watch it. But if you don't, you'll still understand this video, I think. Right? In that video, I used the example, when it rains, it floods. Cum pluat, inundat. When it rains, it floods. A real clear example of a circumstantial sentence. Our main idea is it floods, and then we have a circumstance under which it floods, which is when it rains. All right? Now, this is maybe not the best example because this subjunctive is actually not one of the kinds of subjunctives that's in the video I just told you to watch before you watch this one. Apologies. Also, how do I know that this is the cum clause or the subordinate part? How can you tell? It's 3 words. How do I know when it's so short? Well, I know because there are 2 distinct verbal ideas going on. One of them is in the subjunctive and one of them is not. So how do you know where it starts and stops? I mean, in this sentence, I put a comma on there. That helps. But the Romans didn't have commas, and modern editors may or may not use them. So how do you know? How do you know when the cum clause is over? Let me give you a better example, one that lines up better with what I've already told you about. Check this one out. Cum domum advenisem cum felibus ludebam. Here, I can definitely tell you that this cum clause, even before I think about what it says, I can tell you that this cum clause begins here and ends here. And it's because it starts with the cum, it's pretty obvious. It starts with the cum, and it ends with a verb, all right? This is one of those word order things that, we always say kind of, almost as a trope, that in Latin word order doesn't matter, but except when it does, right? Because, we know that the Romans like to put the verb at the end of the sentence. They don't have to, but they like to. And this is an instance in which that convention becomes even more regular and more useful. Because with the subordinate clause, usually you'll know that the subordinate clause is over because they put the verb of the subordinate clause at the end of it. So it makes a nice little packet. Cum to the verb, and no matter how many words come in the middle, it's going to be cum to the verb. There are exceptions to this, as there always are in language, but that's a real good rule that you can use the vast majority of the time. And so what this ends up actually saying is, when I had arrived at home, I was playing with my cats. I know, I was a little extra tricky here. I put in 2 cums, and this one is the preposition and not the conjunction, but that's fine, right? I mean, it's cum with an ablative. We know that's when it means with, whereas, when it's this conjunction, it'll be cum, and there's not going to be an ablative after it, right? Domum is not an ablative noun. There's no ablative nouns in here at all. So, yeah, so this would be a good example of a cum circumstantial sentence. When I arrived at home, I was playing with my cats, right? So there you go. And if you want another example where, it's not just the cum clause coming first and then the main clause, try this one out over here. Because it doesn't have to be in this order. It could be like this one, where you'll notice my brackets start with my cum and end with my subjunctive verb, but my main clause is actually around it. Now, this is going to bother some of you because in English, this is just not the way we talk. But in Latin, it can be, right? Like I said, they like putting the verb at the end. Well, you can put the subjunctive verb at the end of your cum clause and still have your main verb at the end of the sentence while having your main clause begin before it. It definitely happens sometimes. Or it might also happen like this, where you get cum clause, then main clause. It could happen the other way around. You could have main clause and then cum clause. It doesn't matter. In fact, even in English, you could say, when I had arrived at home, I was playing with my cats. Or you can flip it and say, I was playing with my cats when I arrived at home. So, either way, it doesn't change the meaning of it. But here, right, what we have is, and you will want to say one of them before the other. You don't want to do a weird in the middle thing. But what we have is, when I was thinking about my absent friends, I discovered my tears. I know, I went extra sentimental and kind of epic sad. Anyway, I just thought it was kind of a pretty sentence. But, and by the way, my absent friends here, this refers to my friends who went to roller coaster date without me. So, tears. Anyway, point being is you can see where the cum clause begins, where the cum clause ends, even if there are things around it. So my main idea is just, I discovered my tears. I found my tears when I was thinking about my absent friends. Sigh, right? Great example, again, of a cum clause. And this one where the word order puts it in the middle. Totally a thing that can happen. Not a problem. But I haven't given you a clear example of one that's definitely causal, right? Most of our cums get translated as when, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're going to sound better with a since or because. So like this one here, it says, Uxor parum dormiabat, my wife was sleeping too little, Cum mane felles luderent. You could say a when here, and grammatically it won't sound terrible, but it won't sound as good as if you say because. My wife was sleeping too little because my cats were playing early in the morning. Right? That really seems to be a causal relationship more than a circumstantial one. Right? This is the reason why she was sleeping too little, not just when she was sleeping too little. Then again, you will sometimes have sentences where it's hard to say which one sounds better. And sometimes people have anxiety about this. Sometimes people worry about getting it wrong. They're like, what if I translate it as causal instead of circumstantial? And ultimately, my response to this is don't stress about it too much. One of them will probably sound better than the other one. Go with which one ever sounds like, because there is no grammatical distinction. All of these clauses are just cum plus a subjunctive. There's nothing special in the main clause that tips you off. You're just kind of going with your own intuition and judgment and the semantic meaning of what's being said. And if you have a sentence where it sounds just as good both ways, well, pick the one you like the best. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be some commentator or grammarian who has a real problem with what I just said. But in all honesty, like this does come down to a judgment call. So like with this example, for instance, right? This says everyone was glad or everyone was rejoicing, and now here do we say when we were listening to Stepdad or because we were listening to Stepdad? I mean, here's the thing. It's just hard to be unhappy when you listen to Stepdad. I mean, it's their records are so good. So is this the reason why we were happy, or is it the circumstance for us being happy? And honestly, it's both. So whichever one you like better, you could do. Because we were listening to Stepdad, or when we were listening to Stepdad, we were all glad. So there you go. That is an explanation of cum clauses. Okay? At least an explanation of the cum circumstantial and the cum causal. And for those of you guys in Latin too, that's what you need to know about these two kinds of subordinate clauses. I'm going to come right back real soon with another video. In fact, by the time you watch this, another video on indirect questions may already be uploaded. But, before too many days pass, there's going to be other videos still on other kinds of subordinate clauses. So, make sure that you stay tuned to the channel. Watch for all the places where I post links, and we're good to go. All right. Bye, guys.